Die Gedanken sind frei. Mein Thoughts freely flower.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
Hello, my name is Hugh Henry. This is Freethought Forum, and we're here to talk to Mr. Patrick Filyk, a lawyer who works for the ACLU from time to time. And the subject is the Patriot Act, a citizen's dissent. Mr. Filyk lives in San Antonio and is a lawyer. He's vice president of the San Antonio chapter of the ACLU and practices in areas of criminal defense and civil rights. Mr. Filyk, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So, tell us about this miserable piece of junk.
Well, the USA Patriot Act, as a matter of fact, I've got a copy of it here, and it runs several hundreds of pages, was the government's response to 9/11. And we all recall the events of 9/11. We remember what I have gone around when I've spoken to groups, I call it kind of almost a paralysis that we experienced during that period. All of us felt it, and unfortunately in Washington, the politicians got together and they passed a piece of legislation called the USA Patriot Act, and that was intended to be their response, and basically they stripped away the Bill of Rights and gave the government power to run roughshod over our civil liberties. Now, you'll recall the USA Patriot Act was actually passed about 45 days after the events of 9/11. The atmosphere in Congress was one of panic, I think it's fair to say. The Patriot Act was passed. It's several hundreds of pages long. At the time of its passage, there were only 2 extant copies of the USA Patriot Act. In other words, our congressmen that voted in favor of this sweeping legislation hadn't even had the opportunity to read it. There was one senator, Russ Feingold from Wisconsin, that actually did vote against the USA Patriot Act. When he was asked why, he said, as a matter of policy, I read legislation before I vote for it. So we are stuck with the USA Patriot Act. Fortunately, as I am speaking to you here today, the Patriot Act is under reconsideration by various committees in Washington, D.C. They are now engaged in the process that they should have engaged in when they were first considering this misguided piece of legislation. And by that, what I mean is the Patriot Act is being subjected to the kind of scrutiny that is typically associated with any kind of legislation in Washington.
What amazes me is that this mound of stuff shows up in 45 days. That's just about long enough to print it. I mean, I used to work in Washington, just about long enough to print it and put a title on it. This is like, springing full-blown from the head of Zeus. Where did all this junk come from?
That's a very good question, and one that we speculated on. And having had more of an opportunity to go through it now, I think the best description that I've heard of the USA Patriot Act is it is every piece of legislation that various law enforcement agencies, the DEA, the ATF, the CIA, the FBI, and all the other alphabet soup agencies that we have, all of the legislation that they had proposed over the last several decades and that had been rejected by Congress. So basically they went to their shelf and found all the stuff that Congress wouldn't allow, and at this very difficult moment in American history, a time when the public was clamoring for answers, and it was a time when we just need to take action. We don't really need to think about what we're doing, let's just do something.
I might be a little charitable here. Reagan pulled the same thing on the Defense Department when he said, I want a 10% increase. And the Defense Department grabbed everything on the shelf that they had ever proposed, because in Washington you never turn down money.
That's right.
Because they'll take it away from you in a second, and threw it on the table and said, okay, here, we got something for you to buy.
Right.
Could it simply be the case that somebody said, get me legislation, get me something big, get me some stuff, and everybody grabbed stuff and threw it in, and they didn't read it either.
I think that would be fair to say, unfortunately. And I should tell you that as an organization, the ACLU was monitoring events. Things were moving very quickly, but we made it very clear to the senators and the congressmen that we were available to provide expert witnesses, to provide historical context in order to avert what happened. And unfortunately, the door was closed on us. And unfortunately, I've been speaking out against the Patriot Act basically since its passage. Let me tell you, a few years ago, when I would go to these public forums and I would speak against the Patriot Act, it was a pretty lonely proposition. Oh, wow. Now, years later, I find myself almost, kind of a mainstream kind of figure. And over the last several years, I've debated people from the U.S. Attorney's Office and from FBI. And I can tell you that the responses that I'm getting from groups like the League of Women Voters, for instance, that I think they're coming around to my viewpoint a lot more, and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI are having a much more difficult time explaining to Americans why we need this.
Well, I can imagine why they wouldn't want the ACLU there, because we've got to do something drastic, and the ACLU is going to tell us all these things we've got to do that are drastic we can't do, so we don't want them there.
Right. Yes, well, it's fair to say that we do have a reputation. Other than the United States government itself, we have litigated more cases at the United States Supreme Court than any other organization.
Yeah, we don't want those guys.
Right, right. And we do have some meaningful people that care very deeply about our Bill of Rights. We like to say in our organization that our client is the Constitution. That's all we are concerned about. We are not a political organization. We don't go Democrat. We don't go Republican. We have no permanent allies. We only have permanent principles. And you would think that would be exactly the kind of organization that they'd like to speak to. I should also mention, fairly recently, the American Conservatives Union has stepped on board, and they are fighting along with us.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Right, right.
All you have to do is read it.
That is exactly right. And Americans, I've been really excited when I've gone and I've spoken to people. They are recapturing their pride in America and what makes America special. And they're very alarmed that Washington would seek to take away these basic rights. I think the events in Guantanamo, for instance, where we detained hundreds of people, denied them access to counsel, didn't even tell them what they were charged with. And according to the Inspector General from the Department of Justice, their own Inspector General, put them in deplorable conditions. That's not American. We all know that.
Well, a good deal of this is simply refusal to admit you're wrong, which you're prone to do when you've done something really bad, but also seems to be a policy of the current administration that it has never made a mistake. So nothing in here can be a mistake. But I understand in the case of Guantanamo, they, grabbed people off the field, in Afghanistan, for example,
right,
and did a triage and said, okay, these guys we want to keep, those guys we don't. As quickly as possible, ship them off to Guantanamo, and now their triage in Afghanistan on a battlefield can't possibly be wrong.
Right.
Especially since they've kept these guys for a couple of years.
That's exactly right, and that just seems to be the tone at the White House, is one of denial, even in the face of plain evidence. They've slowly been releasing all of these people from Guantanamo. These people were never charged with anything. But what should be alarming, I think, to Americans is this notion that you or I or anyone else could simply be arrested and detained and then not have access to lawyers or even be told what those charges are. And most importantly, I think, have access to the courts. And that is definitely a big trend that we're seeing.
Okay, could you go very briefly through the process of how that would happen?
Well, for instance, if a client of mine has been arrested, he'll be down at the Bexar County Jail or maybe at the Wackenhut facility for the federal system. He's going to immediately contact me, and I'm going to contact him. And I'm going to ask, as a lawyer, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. What are the nature of the charges? Was it a result of a search, or do you have an actual warrant to arrest this person? And I'm going to want to know, has a bond been set? Bond is a fundamental right that you and I enjoy. Unfortunately, those Guantanamo detainees never were permitted to post bond.
No, what I meant, sir, was how does it work when it doesn't work? When they grab you, haul you away, and nothing. How does that process run?
I'm sorry, maybe I'm not understanding.
Under the Patriot Act, even an American citizen
Yes.
can be arrested, stuck somewhere, etc. How does that process run under the Patriot Act?
Under the Patriot Act, we have learned, and of course this is a piece of legislation that is being interpreted by the courts. Parts of it have already been found unconstitutional by lower courts. But as I understand it now, under the USA Patriot Act, a person can be detained up to and no more than 7 days before they're going to be given what I would call basic due process, habeas corpus. They're going to be allowed to contact a lawyer. They're going to be allowed to petition the courts.
But didn't something quite different happen to Jose Padilla?
Absolutely it did.
What was the sequence there?
Mr. Padilla, I believe he ended up being held, was it 2.5 years?
Yes.
Somewhere around there?
And it was something called an enemy. He was defined by the president as an enemy combatant.
Yeah,
That's what I was talking about. How does that whole series work?
Yes, that's exactly right. Under the USA Patriot Act, the president is allowed to designate somebody as an enemy combatant. Essentially, if you are designated as such, as an enemy combatant, you don't enjoy any rights whatsoever. You are subject to the whim of the executive at that point.
Okay, I think the reasoning behind this works something like this. It stems from a wartime situation where someone, an enemy in a uniform, is captured on the battlefield. They are not guilty of a crime, but they're going to be detained until either they're exchanged with the government that they work for,
Right.
or until the war is over.
Right.
In this case, there's no enemy government, there's no uniform, and it's the president who decides that you're an enemy and you're detained until the war is over, the war being the war on terrorism, and it has no limit date.
That is, our president has put us on notice that this is a war in perpetuity, that I don't get any sense from the actions taken by the current president that there's going to be a meaningful end to this war anytime soon.
So that if you're declared an enemy combatant, which in Padilla's case was an American citizen, I'll get back to that in a second,
Arrested in America.
arrested in America, you could be held until you're dead of old age.
That's correct.
With no charges, simply because you are a terrorist, you were like an enemy soldier, you're held to the end of the war has no end, sorry about that, Charlie. Now, the court said something different about Padilla.
They did. Fortunately, the Supreme Court did not go along with the government on this particular case and a number of other cases. And in that sense, the system does work. Unfortunately for Mr. Padilla and for a number of people, it took 2-3 years for this case to eventually make its way up to the United States Supreme Court.
Then there's another little monkey in this thing that says when the president declares you an enemy combatant and salts you away, he doesn't have to tell anybody.
That is exactly right. And if we go back to what we all learned in high school, I don't mean to use legal terms, but basic habeas corpus, which is the foundation of our American system of justice.
Yeah, but habeas corpus applies to crimes. Padilla is not accused of a crime, never was. Padilla is an enemy, like an enemy on a battlefield. So all of that habeas corpus, which is for U.S. crimes, they would say wouldn't apply here. And apparently the court said, no, we don't care if this is a war against terrorism and he's supposed to be on the other side.
Yes.
You got a problem, son.
Right. Well, the habeas corpus has been part of our jurisprudence going back to the Magna Carta. We inherited that notion from the British, and it has been the core of our jurisprudence since the founding fathers created our wonderful Constitution and our Bill of Rights. And really, I look at the Bill of Rights as really just being a more detailed analysis of habeas corpus.
Yeah, but it's all about, when you talk about jurisprudence, you're talking about the law. You're talking about criminal law here. And the claim is that, no, He didn't commit a crime. We never said he committed a crime. Doesn't have anything to do with crime.
Right.
Has to do with the fact that he's an enemy of the state. He's an enemy terrorist, as if he belonged to another country, which he didn't. He's a U.S. citizen, but that's a detail.
Right.
And so we hold him as an enemy prisoner. Normally, that would be covered under the Geneva Conventions, but we said, no, we don't want to do Geneva Conventions either. We don't want those applied to terrorists because terrorists don't wear uniforms, they're quaint, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
We don't got any rules.
No, I would agree with you. It was very disturbing to hear Alberto Gonzalez, our current Attorney General, apparently in his report to the President, he wrote that he thought that the Geneva Conventions were outmoded and quaint, I think is the term that he used.
Well, there are some things in there that are quaint, by a lot, like allowing prisoners scientific instruments and other stuff that dates from the 17 and 1800s.
Sure.
But it's a case of rules. We don't need those thinking rules.
Right, right. Yep. Well, and if you talk to, as I have, I've spoken to a number of groups that former military, a lot of World War II veterans. Boy, you talk to a group of World War II veterans about the USA Patriot Act, and they're going to tell you, I sacrificed an awful lot to defend the Constitution of the United States, and I'm not going to allow the politicians in D.C. to just, tread on that. Very patriotic. And I think it's important in this time, somehow the government has taken the view that any person that dissents, somehow that's unpatriotic. That couldn't be any further from the truth. Our whole system is prefaced on the notion of dissent and debate.
I have one bumper sticker. It says, "Dissent is the highest form of freedom," quote from Thomas Jefferson.
That's right. It's also interesting along those lines to note that the U.S. Supreme Court itself publishes dissents. In other words, they make decisions, but at the same time, they also simultaneously, if there is one, they'll publish the dissent. Again, that is the whole purpose, to engage in this dialogue and show that there can be differing views.
I spent 20 years in the United States military in the intelligence business. I was never in danger, as far as I know, of being captured. But I know any veteran would have to be made nervous by the thought that America can capture somebody, not tell anybody, salt them away somewhere, torture them, keep them for as long as they want to, because everything is reciprocal. Whatever you do to someone else, they can then do to you.
Yes.
Now, I know, again, the government's argument says since we're not dealing with a government, then there isn't anybody to reciprocate, so why bother? I can think of a lot of military people who would say, I don't think that's a good idea.
I agree. It really scares me.
It's dangerous.
Well, and it worries me about our standing in the world community. I think one of the reasons why we were unable to get any more support from other, say, European countries and that kind of thing is because we were expressing a real hypocrisy. At the same time that we said that we were invading Iraq to promote democracy and human rights and that kind of thing, in our own country, we are denying people what we say are their basic rights. So that's a very inconsistent message, I think, to send to the global community, and hardly a way of rallying the troops.
Okay, let's take a look at how this darn tool has been used. It is here to be used in the war on terror, against those who threaten the United States with terrorism. But you and I both know it's been used against narcos in, I think, Nevada, last I heard.
Right.
Now, we also have the famous RICO Act, racketeering,
corruption,
racketeering, corruption, and so forth. And that's found amazing creative uses,
yes,
including to be used against those who protest against abortion agencies, among other things.
That is exactly right.
You give somebody a tool, they're going to use it all kinds of different ways. I understand also that there was the Foreign Intelligence Court, which was a secret court, which was to deal with these secret surges before the Patriot Act, and they got so upset with what the government was doing before the Patriot Act, and wasn't some of this under Clinton too, where they were using this Foreign Intelligence Court to do things against narcotics or racketeering or anything else they felt it would be useful. And the court that was supposed to be secret and never say anything got so upset, it came up and said, look, this is what's going on, you guys better stop it.
FISA, the Foreign Information Surveillance Court, that has actually been with us for decades, and you're right. There is a cataloged history of abuse, and the Patriot Act seeks to further the use of the FISA court. Now, this is an interesting court for those people that don't know about it. First off, we don't even know where the court meets. We in the ACLU filed an amicus brief on behalf of people that we suspected were being detained, who we didn't even know the name of. And this is kind of a funny story. Here we are as an organization trying to petition to the court on behalf of this unknown, unnamed individual who we think may be held, but we don't know why they're being held. And we drafted the petition or the amicus, and we wanted to file it with the court. Well, we ran into a real problem. Where do you file it? They don't have an address or anything like that you file it to. And then also, we don't know who's on the court. We don't know the identity of any of these judges. And then, if you lose at the court level, there is actually an appeal process. But again, you don't know what court is actually hearing that. And again, you don't know who the judges are. Anyway, interestingly enough, we won that case.
Let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. You won a case for someone you didn't know who might be in a court you didn't know where, charged with you didn't know what. Did you happen to win it on appeal?
We won on appeal.
Okay, appeal to another court that you didn't know where or what. I'd say you guys are good.
Hey, how about that? Yeah, we're pretty proud of that.
You should be.
Right.
But
that's pretty scary, isn't it? I mean, we're laughing here, but it's Orwellian, isn't it?
No, I remember my history. They called this the Star Court, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right.
There was, under King George, there was the Star Court, which met in secret, convicted in secret, and one of the aims of the Constitution was to prevent this from ever happening.
That's exactly right.
It's called the Star Court. You can look it up on the internet, and you can look up all the Founding Fathers talking about what a miserable deal this was.
That's right. That's absolutely. And, you noted about the FISA court and also other abuses chronicled over the last several decades. We have to remind ourselves as Americans, as justifiably proud of our history as we are and should be, we also have to acknowledge that ours is a government that has consistently denied or tried to disparage the civil rights and civil liberties of Americans. You start with the Alien and Sedition Act. No sooner had our government been formed than we passed that horrible piece. That is exactly right. But then you can go further too. Lincoln's attempt to revoke habeas corpus during the Civil War. Only time that the executive, by the way, has done that. But then you get into the communist scare era of the 1930s, and then the McCarthy era of the 1950s. And then we all have to acknowledge that for 200 plus years in our country's history, we allowed an apartheid state. We denied basic fundamental rights to a whole group of citizens simply on the basis of the color of their skin. So that when the government says, trust me, we'll do everything right with this, I'm just a little bit suspicious or a little bit skeptical.
Well, don't forget the Japanese internment. Here we have, these are not Japanese that they're interring, folks. These are American citizens born in the United States of Japanese parents. Only in California. They didn't do it in Hawaii because too many of them were voters in Hawaii,
right,
where Pearl Harbor was. If they'd done it there, they'd have had a riot. So they didn't touch the Japanese in Hawaii. They didn't touch the Germans working in very sensitive positions in the optics business out in New York, in Rochester, because they'd have another political riot there.
Yes.
And it turns out the guy that gave the secrets of Pearl Harbor to the Japanese was a German and a German agent. But these people are interred, and then after the war, They bring a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court says, what you do in wartime, we're not going to question.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one that really, I think...
And we're in wartime, according to this government.
Yes, and it's very much on point. And when I do give addresses, I speak about that, because people remember that. There's actually a surprising number of people that are in the audience that were actually alive when that happened. And I think events like that happen during your lifetime have a resonance that, you know, the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 just don't, for whatever reason.
You think?
Now, interestingly, Judge Scalia, who is a self-described literalist, strict constructionist, very conservative, and usually finds himself, obviously he's a Republican appointee, he has called the internment of the Japanese during World War II the most shameful act in America's history. I was very pleased to see that. And
I could give him some competing incidents, but we won't argue.
Right. There's too many. We only have a half an hour.
Well, besides
here.
which, the Trail of Tears was not the Supreme Court's fault. They said, you can't do this, and Jackson said, fine, you figure out how to stop me.
That is exactly right. And that's a good example of how, of course, we have to go back to our high school civics class, you know, where we were taught about government and how it functions, and that you've got the three co-equal branches of government. And lately what we are witnessing is an attempt to get the judiciary out of the checks and balances that the Founding Fathers intended the government to run on.
Well, only until we can appoint a judiciary that believes completely in what the current government is doing and is willing to go along with all of it.
That is exactly right. Yeah.
In which case, I don't envy you your job.
Yes. Again, though, we are finding ourselves with what a lot of outsiders would call strange bedfellows now. You know, we have allies there, the American Conservatives Union, the NRA. As a matter of fact, just a couple days ago in the Texas legislature, we were we were championing legislation that would put an end to the practice of police officers asking for consent searches. When they had no probable cause to be searching your vehicle, they're just asking you to do it anyway. And we think that's offensive, and that we shouldn't do that. And the NRA came up, and they were the next speaker, and they said, yeah, we don't agree with this either. So I think when we get to, at some point, you know, the politics goes away, and we start caring about this actual document. And that's been our approach all along.
Yeah, but you see, these guys are sometime on the side of these guys and on the side of the other. You can't trust these ACLU guys at all.
Right.
You can't trust them to agree with you.
The thing that I tell people, if we haven't offended you already, just wait a while. We will. We will. No doubt about it. And another thing that I tell people is, if we're not making you angry, we're not doing our job.
That reminds me of Philip Agee, who was responsible for counterintelligence at the CIA, who every day believed that there was a mole that he had not caught in the CIA. And his position was, if any day came when he thought that wasn't true, then he didn't belong in his job.
Yeah, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. There is no question about that.
It's also the price of keeping moles out of the CIA. And when he left, Aldrich Ames came in and spilled everything.
Right.
Well, we're getting close to the end here. We've got a few seconds left, and I didn't even get to one of the points I wanted to raise, which was that the 9/11 Commission, if you laid it next to this book, they don't look very much alike. And that so many things that the Patriot Act wants to do, the 9/11 Commission never said we needed to do, which means they're really a waste of time. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, Mr. Filyk.
I'm happy to do it.
I'd love to have you back again.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
This has been Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny.